Welcome everyone. My name is Simon Bashir and I'm your UDIA National President. First and foremost, all our thoughts are especially with our New South Wales and Victoria colleagues who are in the midst of the current lockdown. Hopefully there's some light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you for joining us today for UDIA TV with our special guest Jason Falinski, Federal MP and Chair of the Standing Committee on Tax and Revenue. Mr. Falinski is leading a federal inquiry into housing supply issues to examine taxes, charges and regulatory settings at local, state and federal levels. As we know, all play a part in impacting housing supply and affordability in this country. We look forward to hearing from Jason soon. First of all, a few housekeeping notes. For the best viewing experience, we recommend Google Chrome. And if at any point the video or sound isn't working, please try refreshing your internet browser. We'll have a live Q&A session with Jason following his speech. So please type your questions into the live public chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. To start the event, UDIA acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. As we know, events like this don't happen without the generosity of our sponsors, and we warmly welcome our major sponsor for today, NBN. NBN has been a fantastic supporter of UDIA for a long time, and we thank you for your ongoing support. Thank you to Jason for joining us today, and more importantly, your inquiry into one of the most crucial public policy issues facing Australia today. We've been blessed over the past year or so to have a government so invested in home ownership. The Prime Minister, the Treasurer, and the Housing Minister all recognised at the start of the pandemic that Australia's economy would need stimulus. In our view, they rightly turned on one of the engines of the economy, the housing and construction sector, that creates 7.5% of the nation's GDP and over 750,000 direct and indirect jobs. Our industry does matter. The creation of HomeBuilder was a key moment in Australia's economic response to the effects of the pandemic. HomeBuilder recognised three things: jobs, wages and activity up and down the supply chains would flow from the injection of stimulus and help sustain the economy. The aspiration of home ownership is very much alive amongst Australians, and giving people a helping hand could greatly assist that. And lastly, Australians have long suffered from an undersupply of housing, so measures that boosted construction helped with that bigger goal. HomeBuilder certainly did its job, with over 140,000 successful applications. But we've also known that the challenges of housing supply, demand and affordability run deep and have a long history in Australia. Put simply, the imbalance between supply and demand have contributed to make Australian housing, some of the least affordable in the world. As a nation, we do a poor job of giving effect to long-term strategic planning, land release, regulatory settings and tax regimes needed to support housing. So Jason, your inquiry is welcome, and we will certainly be active participants in that process. As we prepare to finalise our submission, we've harnessed evidence around the country on the long-term evidence-based analysis of housing supply, demand and affordability and its effects on home builders. The dysfunction that exists primarily at the state and local level when it comes to planning systems, and the role all tiers of government can play in incentivising reforms that will deliver a durable solution. As Australia looks to sustain its recovery from the economic effects of COVID-19, fixing housing markets will be crucial. It's critical to the growth and prosperity of the nation and the social good. Our industry stands ready to partner with government, and UDIA will continue to work with the Commonwealth in recommending practical and implementable solutions to improve the economic prosperity of the nation. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Jason Falinski, Federal MP and Chair of the Standing Committee on Tax and Revenue. Jason has had over 25 years experience in business, including founding his own company in 2004, designing and manufacturing healthcare equipment and furniture for aged care homes and hospitals. Prior to this, he worked in roles in financial services, banking and corporate governance. During his first 2 years in Parliament, Jason has established a reputation as a strong and tenacious fighter who refuses to duck the big issues, and this has been highlighted by his recent appointment as the Chair of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Tax and Revenue. Before Jason joins us, we'll see a short video from our major sponsors for today's event, NBN.
Access to business NBN fibre has changed for good. With wholesale speeds close to 1 gigabit per second and a wide choice of providers, we're making business fibre more accessible in more locations than ever to improve high-speed connectivity right across Australia. Search Business NBN Fibre today.
NBN, as I said, they've been great supporters of UDA for many years, and we welcome their continual involvement and support of us. Jason, once again, welcome. We're looking forward to your address. We're looking forward to submitting our submission on Monday afternoon, close of business. We'll probably need all that time to get it finished. We've got lots of evidence coming in from membership and our state representative UDA branches, which is fantastic. Over to you now to address our audience today, and then we'll move to a Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Simon. I really appreciate the welcome, and I really appreciate your organisation having me here today. So, look, I shouldn't probably prejudge what the inquiry is going to find, but I just thought that I would take a few minutes to kind of frame it for everyone online today. The first thing I want to do is to apologise for the state of my office behind me, but at least you know this isn't some sort of Zoom background, it's actually real life. The second thing I wanted to say is that I probably know where a lot of you are coming from, which is all you want to do is build houses, hopefully sell them for more than it costs you to build them, take that money that you have left over, pay some salaries, pay some tax, and have a bit of working capital left over at the end of it so that you can move on to your next project. So you're probably sitting there thinking, I don't really have time to get involved in in any government inquiry, much less another one. And so we come to this inquiry about why are we once again dragging the industry through it? Well, the answer to that is because it's important. It's not just important to you and the viability of your industry, but it's important to us as a nation. We live in the least densely populated continent in the world. Only the South Pole has less people on it than Australia. We also have, and by the way, Australia claims about 45% of the South Pole, so that some of it, that's ours too. We have the highest average weekly earnings in the world. We have the highest minimum wage by almost 50% of anywhere else in the world. And yet we have the least affordable housing by some measures anywhere in the world, but on any measure in the top 20 least affordable locations in the world, literally every capital city in Australia is included in that top 20. We have more in common with Hong Kong and Singapore than we do with the open prairies of Minnesota and Idaho. It makes no sense. Some would say that's not a bad thing. People who own a lot of our banking system is based on the value of our land and our properties that people then borrow money against. A lot of people own housing in Australia. So maybe we should just learn to live with the least unaffordable land property in the world. But there are some costs to that I think our inquiry should investigate. The first is obviously the price of housing and the cost to our economy, that when federal, state, the Reserve Bank pumps money into our economy, it typically does not go in to the building of more homes. It typically goes into actually increasing the price of those homes we have higher and higher, creating, some would argue, an asset bubble. The problem with asset bubbles are, at some point they burst, and we saw in Japan in 1989 the generation-long implications of having assets that get out of whack with the underlying reality. The second thing that I think we need to think about is the social cost of this. The cost to mental health. We know that if you own your own home, you will obviously feel more secure, you will feel far more grounded, you will feel that you have a safe haven. We know those nations with higher levels of home ownership tend to have better mental health outcomes. Family formation. We know in Western countries with high, and areas within those countries that have high housing prices, people delay having children. The implications to our society of that, especially an ageing society, are well known and are real problems that we are going to face in Australia in the near term. We are somewhat protected from that because we have such high levels of immigration. But during this period of COVID-19, a number of people have said, this shows that we can shut off immigration and not have immigration. The impact of that in terms of family formations and the demography of our country is absolutely massive. We then have problems with wealth inequality. You'll often hear those people on the left of our society, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Bill Shorten, they'll talk about things like you've got expanding levels of inequality in Australia. The truth is that income inequality in Australia has gone down over the last 3 decades, mostly through our tax and transfer system. We have the most progressive tax system in the world. Our tax system is 29 times more distributive than the United States, 19 times more redistributive than France. So that has seen income inequality decline. What we have seen, though, and what Thomas Piketty points out in the data at the end of his book, is that you have inequality increasing due to home ownership. People who've been able to buy assets over the last 4 decades are now materially wealthier than those people who have not. It's not about the 1%ers. It's about the 50%ers who own property and the 50% of people who don't. We have home ownership and property ownership is incredibly important to the stability of your democracy. If you feel you have a stake in your country, both financial and in real terms, and you have the opportunity of having a stake in the wealth creation of your nation, then your democracy tends to be more stable. What we are finding around people under the age of 40 is a massive radicalisation, particularly in the United States, but also here in Australia, as people under 40 increasingly begin to give up on the prospect of liberal democracy as being able to provide them with the same economic opportunities that generations who came after them had. It's important to note that the liberal democracies that grew out of the Second World War were all formed on the basis of large property-owning middle classes. What we have at the moment is, if you're under 40, you are less likely to own. Ownership levels amongst people under 40 is lower in Australia than it has been since 1947, the census of 1947. And when that census data is updated towards the end of this year, early next year, we suspect we will find that home ownership amongst people under the age of 40 is the lowest it has ever been since Australia started taking data on that. the impact of that on our democracy and the stability of our democracy is real and should be a worry for all of us. Domestic violence. We know that if people feel they can leave homes and go elsewhere, there is likely to be lower levels of domestic violence. Financial stress, that goes without saying. Financial security. The report after report after report on retirement incomes actually shows that our $3.3 trillion superannuation system has had a marginal impact on financial security in retirement. But the biggest driver of it is if you own your own home and you have a large amount of equity in your own home when you retire. Then we have problems around fractional and frictional unemployment. In Australia, mostly due to stamp duty, people feel that they can't move to other parts of Australia to take up economic opportunities or employment opportunities. The result of that is that we have a level of, we will never know what the opportunity cost of that is, but we know that we have a level of unemployment because people starting businesses, particularly in regional areas, can't get qualified workers to those regional areas because people are afraid to leave the big cities because they may not be able to come back. So the question then comes, well, if you live on this wide open expanse of land, how do you have so much, how have we ended up with a result where you have so much unaffordable land? The left will tell you that it's because of the tax system. They'll tell you, firstly, supply has no impact on prices. They will also tell you that our tax system has encouraged us to use land, our property and dwellings as a speculative investment rather than for the purpose of actually housing people. The problem with the supply argument is that they usually cite examples like the Gold Coast and Newtown as areas where supply was allowed to increase, but prices still went up. The problem with that is that it is like listening to a person clap with one hand. It doesn't take account of the fact that demand for property in that area had been outstripping supply for decades beforehand and continued to outstrip increases in supply even when it was provided. So it's a false analysis and frankly a fake one at that. The other argument about the tax system has some merit. There is no doubt that stamp duty creates barriers to transactions. There is no doubt that the CGT concessions created problems. There is no doubt that the first home buyer schemes pump up prices, and while it reweights it in terms of first homeowners, it doesn't necessarily provide for more affordable housing. I have significant doubts that negative gearing, and it's a debate that I think the inquiry should listen to, that negative gearing on the whole causes affordability problems, as I think it probably supplies subsidies to the area that flow through to renters and also investors into the market that allow people to build more housing stock. Then the left will tell you that we have a deficiency in social housing and affordable housing. I think there is a large argument around crisis housing, and they often try to muddy the waters around there. But the issue that you have is that social housing is housing commission. And it seems quite obvious that since World War II, housing commission has had a lot of negative impact on vulnerable communities, and query whether building more actually helps people in challenged communities or vulnerable states. Affordable housing in different guises can do different things, but ultimately it has the problem of reducing supply while increasing costs, and in some cases looks and smells like rent control, which every economic analysis that's been done since the 1970s shows that rent control actually means that people pay higher rents. You then have the issue, I think, of building costs, where we have a problem of whether we can get enough prefabricated material into Australia. That seems to be an industrial relations issue that has been driven by the CFMEU. You have taxes on inputs. You have unfair treatment of different investors, particularly when it comes to build to rent, and whether those challenges and whether the differential that was introduced by my government, frankly, before I was elected, I might quickly add, but by my government, has helped or hindered us get more long-term rental supply into the market. And then you have the big issue, I think, which is what the committee wants to look at, which is, do we have flexible enough zoning laws in Australia to allow changes in land use to happen when and as they become necessary, to allow investors and builders to build as demand increases, or is the lag so great that we don't get to that point? And indeed, when does the lag ever catch up? The overhanging in demand is now, by some counts, almost 400,000 dwellings. And then, of course, all of this is administered by what I consider to be that tier of government, being local government, which is most susceptible to corruption and, frankly, incompetence, and also has the least amount of transparency. We have seen them ramp up costs on new developments. In New South Wales, 12%, and this is just going to go higher. This is going to go much, much higher in the next few years. $85,000 of a new home is due to charges laid by local governments. I'm told by a friend of mine who's a builder in Port Macquarie that when we introduced the $25,000 homemaker scheme, fees and charges by Port Macquarie Hastings Council over the next 3 weeks for new homes increased by, you guessed it, $25,000. These are real, and they'll never come off. Once they're on, they never come off. They get baked into the system. So as you can see, we've got a Gordian knot. And the real question for us is, A, let's bring all this research together. B, let's frame it in the moral terms in which it should be seen. And C, let's actually start saying that we as a federal government are not going to hand over tens of billions of dollars per year to states and territories to spend or misspend on housing unless, similarly to the National Competition Policy Framework of the 1990s, we see real and sustainable reforms to the housing market that benefit people in all the areas we've talked about, so that we can return our nation to a nation of, frankly, hope and opportunity. I'm happy to stop there. In fact, I probably should have stopped much earlier and take questions. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Jason. Just to click back on. Thanks for that. So there's some fairly strong words there from the Commonwealth government. Obviously, there's been a lot of heavy lifting that the Commonwealth did in June last year, June 2020, when Home Builder Mark 1 hit. I think it was June the 2nd or June the 4th, one of those two dates. And then obviously the Housing Minister Sukkar extended various things throughout the ensuing months after that. So there's a couple of questions up which I'll read, and I'm sure that everyone on the call can read themselves. You mentioned about the billions of dollars that the federal government supplies the states every year on housing-related matters. So the first question relates to that. The federal government spends billions of dollars on housing every year. Much of this goes on making up for the policy failures of the states in providing adequate housing supply. Given that a lot of property-related issues are state-based issues, how do you think that we can get reforms and align incentives that deliver more housing and maybe in time the less need of the federal funds?
Well, that's the idea. So the inquiry is about how do we do that. I have some ideas ab initio before I've done a lot of reading and I've spoken to a lot of people, not just in the last couple of months, but for many, many years. I don't think we should underestimate this as a political issue. For people under the age of 40, housing is, as John Howard would say, the barbecue stopper. And if we cannot deliver as a political class on this, the implications are about our whole system of community and what it is being replaced by. I mean, The Economist this week has a front page leader on the illiberal replacement that will come if liberal democracies cannot deliver on this, particularly in Australia. But yes, we have a huge amount of moral suasion in this area. I think the biggest issue is, so all the other issues can, I mean, you know, Malcolm Turnbull used to say to me, a tax debt is a good problem to have because it meant you made the money. And I think if we have a lack of skills, difficulty in supply chains and getting stuff, all that sort of stuff, they're good problems to have because it means that we're building the houses and the dwellings that we need for our children and the children that come after us. So that's an important thing for us to be doing. But the big issue is zoning. The big issue is, and it's not about just releasing blocks of land on the edges of our cities. It's about allowing there to be higher density closer to where people want to live in higher density properties. It's about aligning transport infrastructure to those areas. So New South Wales goes and builds a train line out to Rouse Hill, planning to build 300,000 dwellings along that train line. You know, they've built something like about 50,000, and I think it'll be lucky if they top out at about 100,000. Now that's appalling. And what that really means is there are a whole bunch of people out there who could have been buying affordable houses who will not be able to do that because the New South Wales government planning system makes it impossible for builders to build dwellings for people. And just think about it in those terms. That what sort of zoning system, what sort of moral right does a planning system have to exist when it stops people from being able to live in their own homes? That's the moral question that I think the committee needs to get into.
That's good, and I think it probably flows into a question that Steve's raised, which is a fairly big question, is about what do you think the barriers to increasing supply and improving affordability? You mentioned rezoning, you mentioned infrastructure. We would talk about enabling infrastructure that opens up corridors of supply. You talked about or you made references to housing diversity or housing choice in terms of flexibility. And I live in New South Wales, and there's local governments out there with state environmental planning policy that are actually going the other way in reducing the flexibility for seniors to age in place, age in their community, you know, needing to chase retirement villages 30, 40, 50 kilometres away, which is not what they want to do. Are there any other key barriers that you see? Just picking up on Steve's question, other barriers that you see that...
Yeah, well, I mean, tax. Yeah, tax is a huge one. So I think that, you know, I think when you look at the problem, it's kind of, it's probably 60 to 70% planning and zoning. It's probably 20% tax, and it's probably 10% having enough skilled workers, being able to get prefabricated materials from overseas, ensuring that infrastructure is aligned to the supply of land. I mean, all those things come in, but zoning is by far the biggest one, followed by tax. And I mean, I touched on Joe Hockey made that change to foreign investment, which has impacted build to rent. Stamp duty basically makes the transaction costs of housing so high that people just sit in houses that are no longer sensible for them to sit in, partly because they're worried that if they sell out of the market, they can't get back in. And the cost of getting back in is so high due to stamp duty. They're real and honest problems that people have.
All right. I'll just skip one question from, and just talk about the apartment market. Now, obviously, when Home Builder was launched in June last year, quite rightly, it targeted immediate building activity because, you know, we're at a precipice of unemployment running rife through our property industry. So the Treasurer, Minister Sukkar, and the Prime Minister all targeted immediate, which we understood and we got. But what it did miss out on was helping the medium density and apartment markets significantly. In fact, they were basically missed through that stimulus because of the design, and that's not necessarily a criticism, but the design of that stimulus, because of the long lead times, was probably not seen to increase employment straight away, which was the main aim. Given where our net overseas migration's been since COVID hit, look at the Centre for Population and Treasury's forecast for population, or net overseas migration population coming back into this country is only going to dribble up and probably not hit till late 22, 23. The apartments markets of certainly Sydney, Melbourne, and to a lesser extent Brisbane, and then Adelaide and Perth, need something to get going, to give the confidence for the developers to get applications in, because the pipelines of supply in that medium density and high-rise market is very, very slim. What do you see that the federal government could do in the apartment and medium density space to help the supply pipelines increasing to what they need to be going forward?
Yeah, look, I mean, Simon, I think you've answered your own question there, which is effectively our capacity to change. Well, firstly, I think we should be dwelling neutral. So whether someone wants to live in an apartment or a home or a terrace is totally up to them. The real question for them is that can they get something out of the ground sooner rather than later? And that really does come down to zoning and the approval process, which is run by, the least efficient tier of government that we have in Australia. And that's really something that we need to do something about.
Okay. Steve's asked a question, the NIMBY factor. You talk about flexibility of zonings, flexibility of density and housing choice. Obviously, that does have community opposition. Some of it justified, some of it probably not. Is there anything that could be done at the federal level to actually overcome the resistance to providing more housing?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, let me be blunt, which is I don't think that we should force housing on communities per se. If they don't want them, then don't have them. What I do think, though, is that you can't have what you've got in New South Wales at the moment, which is you can object to something for, it seems like 25 years. You look at the Leppington corridor, it was approved back in 2007, and the Department of Planning is yet to provide a single permit for someone to turn a sort of soil down there. And that's just because, every time they get approval, someone comes up with another reason to object to it. I do think that there are plenty that we need to incentivise councils to understand the benefit of growing housing stock in their area. I think we need to align infrastructure using value sharing or value capture, because I think that when you actually drill down on why most people are opposed to housing, more housing stock in their area, it usually comes down to the fact that they don't want what common property, or the commons as it's called in economics, being overused by yet more people. But if you can, and that's typically roads, that looks like traffic congestion, especially in Sydney, but in all capital cities. So if you can get to the point where you can say, look, we need to increase housing stock, but we're also increasing transport infrastructure, then I think most people see that as a bargain that they can live with. I mean, one of the other problems we've had in New South Wales is the overuse of granny flats. So you've got essentially residential areas that had 3-lane roads through the middle of them that are 1 lane because everyone's parking on the street because they've all got granny flats in the backyards.
Okay. There's a comment here from Michelle. Jason, social housing isn't just housing commission. Public housing owned by the states is, I suspect that's meant to say. Community housing providers increasingly deliver social housing and has a positive impact on communities. They also deliver affordable housing, offering a 25% discount to market rent.
Well, that's rent control. I mean, look, I'm sorry, but we have a system in New South Wales now where councils can step in when someone gets approval to build a house. So I'm now going to build a house in my own community of the Northern Beaches. There's someone who's building a $1.5 million house, which is not a mansion by any stretch of the imagination. They've been slugged with a $500,000 affordable housing charge, so thereby making their house 25% more expensive. So tick to affordable housing on that policy, so that the council can take the $500,000 and buy a house out of the market, out of the private sector, to give to, key or someone who needs affordable housing. Let me tell you right now, that has lowered the amount of housing that's in the private sector, it's increased the price of it, and it's handed administration of affordable housing to the least transparent and most, without being, it's simply the fact, the most venal level of government we have. Affordable housing is, in most guises, rent control. We have known since the 1970s, rent control makes the cost of everyone else's housing more expensive. You have a real life example on the Northern Beaches right now of that. Now, if social housing doesn't include, isn't housing commission, as I understand it, we're happy to hear about different models of how that can look. If affordable housing means that you can increase, as it did in London for a while, under Boris Johnson, where you were able to increase, if you were building an apartment building and you said, if you give us 25% more, so we can go 25% higher, I guess, and that extra stock we will provide at discounted rent for 10 years and then put it back into the marketplace. Yeah, that makes some sense, but why not just build more houses? Why not just create more dwellings so people have more things to buy? This argument, which was always, no one can afford housing. So now we've got lower interest rates. So the price of housing went up. Then it was the fault of our net migration. So now we've had no net migration for the last 18 months. Guess what's happened? The price of housing has still gone up. There are just some people in this discussion who will walk around the world to avoid what is staring everyone in the eye, which is our planning systems do not allow people to build enough housing for people who want to buy housing. Now, come up with every scheme in the world you want, but at the end of the day, unless there's housing for people to live in, it's unaffordable. Increase the price.
Sure.
That's the simple answer.
Yeah, certainly the planning system, the tax regimes and the fees and charges on our industry are hugely hurtful to viable developments actually getting off the ground to deliver that supply. Don't argue with that.
Simon, that's the second order thing, which is the tax system that then makes, you can't even get, Daniel Andrews announces he's going to spend $9.5 billion on 11,700 social houses, dwellings. He hasn't got a single one built yet because even in Victoria, he can't get it through the approval system. So you've got all these communities saying, well, we don't want them in our thing. On the Northern Beaches, the council will say no to any new housing, but if it's social housing, they'll say no twice, just to make sure that everyone gets the message. The issue is the planning system. Then we can get to other problems like there are viable, if not for these tax systems, you would be able to build these houses, these apartments, this development. Absolutely no doubt about it. But that's a second order issue compared to the fact that even if you wanted to build it, you still can't. So we can change the tax system until the cows come home. How are you going to get past the planning systems, the courts and the local governments? Is a question.
All right. Okay. I might pivot to another topic, which is very much in the federal sphere. A question's come through from Tim. Will the inquiry consider build to rent, given the states have already started introducing reforms? There's a burgeoning industry now building, which is great, to facilitate supply for long-term renters, whether they choose to rent long-term or from an affordability point of view, it forces them to rent. But the Commonwealth has retained that the MIT trust concession at 30%, which acts as a constraint to that investment. Has the thought at the Commonwealth level to re-look at the MIT status for build to rent and actually support the states in providing a little bit more throughput in the build to rent market?
So the answer to that, Simon, is I'm not going to give you an answer other than to say, yes, we will. This has been raised by a lot of people. We will continue to so it will be a focus of the inquiry. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. I'll keep going through to Chi. Will the inquiry consider the impact of Commonwealth stimulus to the housing sector? Do you think the home builder stimulus has a positive or negative impact on housing affordability? I think you've probably referred to a little bit with the local government.
Yeah. Look, I think at the end of the day, the home builder scheme was about, as you've mentioned, getting throughput at a time when it looked like building activity was about to decline to close to zero. So it was about getting was about incentivizing people to make that decision now. So did it make it affordable or unaffordable? The answer is, I think either way it would have been marginal. Where I think it had unintended consequences was that you had a whole bunch of councils, including the one on the Northern Beaches, but Port Macquarie was the one I was told about, that increased their charges in the case at Port Macquarie Hastings, it matched the incentive. So did it have a positive impact up there? No, it didn't. But it did actually get what it was intended to do, which was to help people start building. It did that. To maintain activity in the building sector, it did that. And I think that it will ultimately have had a positive impact in terms of getting people into homes that otherwise wouldn't have.
Okay. I'll keep going, Jason, because there's a myriad of questions here. Is the inquiry focused on housing supply in simplistic terms, or will it look more deeply at the location of supply and how location can impact affordable living through public transport access to jobs, local services, etc.?
Yes, we will. We will. I think that will be a focus of the committee, particularly at the transaction level, but also at the alignment between infrastructure and affordable land. I think the other thing I would mention is land use change as well. So there are a lot of, and when people hear that, they think, turning a detached house into a block of flats. But it's more than that. It's about whether, something that 100 years ago it was sensible to have a house there, is it now more sensible to have a commercial property there? That sort of question.
All right. I'll ask a question from Cameron before you answer it, or I throw to you to answer it. I'll make a comment on it if I can. What about negative gearing? Because you mentioned that earlier. Surely removal of this would make home ownership more attainable. Seems maintaining this is protecting the top level investors and leaving others behind and not giving them a fair go. Now, before you answer that, now this is a members section, so everyone can put their questions up. Certainly from a UDA position point of view, we support where the government, in terms of maintaining the current negative gearing settings and the capital gains tax setting right now. And in fact, I think the ALP has dropped that policy that they took to the last election under Bill Shorten. There is no evidence to us. In fact, the studies that we've done point to the contrary, that actually removing negative gearing doesn't actually help top end of town, because many investors are low to middle that have one property only, and the output of that is actually making housing more expensive and increasing rents. Have you got a comment regarding that?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, this was a area of a lot of discussion up to the 2019 election. All the economic studies that I've seen on this say that yes, it does have it has a number of impacts on the housing market. some of those impacts are to drive up prices of housing. However, that is well and truly offset by the impacts that other parts of the policy have on making housing more affordable. The other big thing which finally got me across on the, and by the way, the other thing is, Cameron, when you look at other parts of the world that got rid of negative gearing, it had no, housing unaffordability continued to become more acute. That is, it got worse. So whether it's London, Auckland, wherever you want to look. But the other big thing that happened was you started getting large companies, large REITs into the market, buying up residential housing stock for the purpose of renting. And so you start to lose diversity of ownership in your rental, in your housing stock. And that really happened in London in particular. And I would feel I'm one of those people who feels uncomfortable when you get concentration of ownership in different markets. And one of the things that negative gearing allows is for people on average weekly earnings to invest some of those earnings in housing, which means we have a diversity of housing stock in Australia. It means that we have more equality across the board in what we're doing in terms of housing stock, and we have more people involved and being able to invest in the Australian economy. So from that perspective, I actually quite like it as a policy. I don't think it has, if it has an effect, if it makes housing more unaffordable, it is not material. I think the figures that I've seen and the models that I've looked at demonstrate, if anything, it makes it marginally less unaffordable. But I think it has the massive social impact of ensuring that we have diversity of ownership in our housing market.
And listen, we don't disagree with the diversity of ownership, but that's not to the expense of what we believe a build-to-rent sector can actually provide as an alternative. Sure. Not as a replacement, but as an alternative, longer-term, secure rental accommodation with a different lifestyle attached to it for Australia. It's been done overseas and well. It doesn't dominate, but it's part of that housing spectrum mix.
So, Simon, I could be wrong, but my understanding of BTR in other jurisdictions, well, in Australia it's 0% or close to 0%. In other sophisticated, mature housing markets in the rest of the world, BTR or something like it represents about 15% of the market. Yeah. So it would seem to me that there's an unmet demand in our housing supply. But these are arguments that need to be made to the committee. But yes, I understand the argument.
Yep. Okay. A question from Steve. Your home state of New South Wales, and I think we've certainly spoken about it nationally, is pushing tax reform to shift away from stamp duty. You've mentioned that before. But it's made the point that it requires Commonwealth assistance on the transition to reward productivity and the obstructive GST formula, which acts as a barrier to reform. What's your personal take on the case for tax reform, and where could the Commonwealth play to help the transition for all state governments to get off the drug called stamp duty?
Well, look, it's time for the states to honestly grow up on this front. It doesn't require federal government intervention or federal government assistance to do it. They can simply, and I say this with confidence because I was working in the State Treasurer's office when we looked at this policy in 2014. It can be easily funded by bond issuance, which at the moment, given that bonds are at 1.1%, means that you lose virtually no money in a recurring downward trend because houses in New South Wales turn over on average every 10 years. You can make it a choice. So people can decide as they're purchasing their home whether they want to pay, we call it a service fee, but land tax or stamp duty. We all know that everyone's going to choose service fees over stamp duty. And so you can close off the stamp duty system within the next 5 to 10 years. None of that requires any federal government intervention. It just requires political will. And people, frankly, in New South Wales to understand the true cost of stamp duty on, how much smaller the economy and thereby their economic opportunities are due to stamp duties. There is nothing stopping the state government from changing over today. It just requires political will and the capacity to go and have that discussion with the people who they govern. And that's really on them, not on the federal government.
Okay. A question from Cole. Housing supply, and that's across the country, greenfield, infill and apartments, isn't measured consistently from state to state. NIFIC has a theoretical top-down approach. Will you look at a more consistent bottom-up planning / infrastructure approach with industry input to measure supply and delivered supply, not academic supply? I might add.
Yes. So the answer to that question is absolutely. Every report that I've written, which I think is now 5, always has a recommendation in it to do something with actually getting better data and more verified data, because at the point that you make, Simon's absolutely the right one, which is there are a whole bunch of people claiming that there's supply when in actual fact supply doesn't exist. It might exist on someone's spreadsheet, but that's it. I don't want to predict the outcome of the inquiry, but I'm almost certain that one of the things that will be in there will be a consistent approach to data around not just housing supply, but a whole bunch of other underlying factors.
Right, and just a supplementary question from me. We talked about the Commonwealth wanting to get a return on its investment from the billions it provides to the states on housing-related issues. Is it your view that you're looking to set and agree supply and deliverable supply targets up front and use influence in the money that you might provide to keep the states honest to meeting those supply targets, and the role that you could play in that?
Yeah, I don't think... so I don't want to predict the outcome of the inquiry, but I think something that we would be more focused on is the systems that lead to the outcome of increased supply. So, and one framework to use is Ian Harper's, not Ian Harper's, the competition policy framework of the 1990s, which basically wasn't so much outcome driven, but was kind of policy process driven. So it might be both. It might be, look, if you do these things, we should see these outcomes. If we don't see these outcomes, we know you've done a shifty on us and you're holding it up somewhere else. I mean, the classic example would be the Rudd government's affordable housing grants in 2009, where the Commonwealth handed over $9 billion, and all the state governments did was they cut their funding to social and affordable housing that aligned with the $9 billion that came in from the federal government. So it wasn't necessarily focused on the outcome. It was just focused on the input, and it didn't look at system reform, which was another big part of the problem.
Well, certainly we welcome this inquiry, and we understand the planning systems and the zonings and all the layers of bits that go with it and the charges that go with it. But ultimately, there needs to be outcomes on the ground, right? Because, housing, there's been a number of inquiries, a number of looks and productivity commission reports, all the kind of stuff that goes with it. RBA's had a crack at it and various things. But ultimately, the linkage of funding to deliverable outcomes is certainly where our submission will be focusing on as well, because all talk and no action doesn't change anything. And we need to not be in the same spot that we were 5, 10, 15 years ago with the amount of discussions that we've continually had in this area. So, if we could provide one level of sort of idea is to link support and deliverable outcomes to make a genuine change and step change in this area. So from that point of view. Now, we're close to the finishing of I've just got one last question from Peter. When will the inquiry conclude, and when will any proposed reforms be communicated?
Well, when the inquiry should conclude round about the end of October, early November. It does depend. We don't want to stop anyone from having input into the inquiry's deliberations. We are hoping to try and get the report tabled in Parliament by December, but it may be that it has to get held over till the first week of February. It will just depend on what, how big the issue is. So that's the timetable at the moment.
Okay, no problem.
I reserve the right to change my mind though.
That's fine. There's a couple more questions that I didn't get to throughout the list. Apologies for the people I couldn't get to, but Jason's on a fairly tight time frame here, and we're 2 minutes to go. So we might just take those questions on notice. I think there's one from Steve, one from Cameron again, and make sure that we've got that at least somewhat covered in some way or shape or form in our submission from that point of view. Just in conclusion, Jason, just in the last minute we've got, thank you very much for joining us today. I know taking an hour out of your diary is hard work sometimes. The inquiry is hugely important. We are going to be active participants in this process. We thank you for the initiative to set this up and chair it. But as I said, the proof's in the pudding about what we see that comes out of it in terms of, and not end up having a talk fest that doesn't actually put the onus back on the states, and to a lesser extent the feds, to actually increase supply and then have that positive effect on affordability. So from that point of view, we look forward to the next few weeks and months of the inquiry and the outcomes of it. And certainly we will maintain behind the scenes communication with your office and help in any way behind the scenes that we can with this inquiry. So again, from all of us that joined us today and all our membership around the country, thank you very much for joining us. We've had a good relationship with the Commonwealth Government in very recent times, and we hope that continues as much as we can. So again, I'll take responsibility to thank Jason on behalf of all of us. We're keen to get your thoughts on today's event, so I encourage you to answer the poll on the right-hand side of the screen if you can. Thanks again to NBN. They've been fantastic supporters. I wish everyone the best. I wish everyone in Sydney and Melbourne the quickest out of lockdown period that we can get. I think the Premier in New South Wales certainly made announcements on that today. Again, thanks for everyone for attending. Thank Jason again, and very much have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.